Tonight's special guest speaker, Dr. Aaron Adams, is the Director of Science and Conservation at Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, and he's an affiliate faculty member at Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. Dr. Adams has dedicated his career to protecting and conserving game fish and the places that they live. He received a bachelor's degree from St. Mary's College in Maryland, a master's degree from the College of William and Mary, and a PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. He also holds a U.S. Coast Guard captain's license. As Director of Science and Conservation at BTT, Dr. Adams is responsible for formulating, overseeing, and implementing BTT's Science and Conservation Plan and applying scientific findings to conservation and management via interactions with resource management agencies and other NGOs. Dr. Adams has been an author or co-author on more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He's also authored 3 books, contributed to 4 book chapters, and published countless magazine articles translating fish science into an angler-friendly language. When he's not working, he's either surfing or fishing, and I can tell you that is the absolute truth. Please help me welcome to the stage my very good friend, Dr. Aaron Adams.
Thanks. Thanks, Zach. Okay, with that, I'll take any questions. Yeah, so for those of you who've seen me talk before, this talk is going to be a little bit more wonky than I usually give, because first I'm going to take you down a rabbit hole of despair, and then towards the end I'm going to bring you back up because there's a lot of hope. Kind of get to the punchline. If we were in the field, say, of oncology, the study of cancer, we were cancer doctors 30 years ago, and a patient came in, we didn't know much. We couldn't do much. There's been so much research done on cancer that if you are a cancer patient, your chances are much better. We're in that place now with the marine research that we do. It's just now a matter of getting the doctors, the politicians, to actually apply that. So that'll make sense as I go through this. I'm going to cover a lot of different things, but towards the end, bring them all together. So stick with me. So what is Bonefish Tarpon Trust? It's a science-based conservation organization. It was founded by anglers and fishing guides in 1998 because they were concerned about declines in the populations of bonefish and tarpon at the time, and since then also permit. For those of you who don't know, bonefish, tarpon, and permit. But even though we focus on the recreational flats fishery, because it's economically and culturally important, which gives us leverage for conservation, our focus is on habitat and water quality. And so if we can protect these species, we have pretty broad conservation benefits. So for example, if we can protect the habitats used by tarpon, we're also protecting habitats used by manatee. So how does Bonefish Tarpon Trust work? Conceptually, we're kind of in the middle of a triangle. And part of our job is to interact with the fishery or the people who fish, resource managers, and also scientific researchers. And that kind of seems like, well, yeah, duh, of course you should. When BTT first started in the 1990s, this didn't happen. Matter of fact, most of the dotted lines didn't happen. Between managers and scientific researchers somewhat, but this type of communication didn't go on. Over the last 20 years, that's changed a lot. So the fishing community actually contributes to management. For example, they work with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Everybody's familiar with the red tide on the West Coast, yes? The fishery closures that happened after the 2018 red tide were a collaboration between the fishing community and FWC. So that's changing. That's a good development. Okay, so with that, a brief overview of Bonefish Tarpon Trust. I'm going to start out with kind of build a foundation and work up from there. So healthy fisheries depend on healthy habitats. That seems pretty obvious, right? But you'll see very shortly why I bring this up. So the amount of habitat or the type of habitat influences fish population size. If you're a type of fish that needs seagrass, relies on seagrass, and you have good, healthy seagrass beds, you're going to have a high population size. But if the quality of that seagrass becomes very poor because of algae blooms and is just barely remnant, then the chance of survival and growth and all those things that make a healthy population decline precipitously. Habitat connectivity is also important. Natural rivers and creeks and wetlands, all those connections support the different life stages of a lot of the fish that we depend on for fisheries and a lot of other organisms as well. But what's happened in Florida, we have a big legacy of water management where those connections have been broken. And it's not much different than I'm sure you've heard about salmon. If you put up dams in a river that interrupt the salmon migration, you do the same type of thing to bonefish, tarpon, permit, snook, and a host of other species. So with that as the baseline, here we go down the rabbit hole. We've already lost 50% of our mangroves in Florida. So if you're a species that depends on mangroves for part of your life cycle, there's no way, even if we stopped all fishing right now, that the population would be like it was, say, 150 years ago. And to just kind of put this in reference, 100 years ago, Miami did not exist. Think about that. There was a small fishing village. Miami did not exist. So in the past 100 years, all that change has happened to the habitats. We've lost about 2 million acres of seagrass. And if you're a seagrass-dependent species, say like redfish, red drum in the Indian River Lagoon, populations are way down. Spotted sea trout are way down because of loss of seagrass. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We've also lost close to 50% of our wetlands. And then there's a lot of species, from waterfowl to migrating birds to fish that depend on those wetlands. So we know that we depend on habitat. We know that we've lost a lot of that habitat, and so that kind of puts us in a challenging situation. And also I have to talk about water quality, of course, because water quality from a fish perspective is the most important habitat. This is a picture a friend of mine took. This is Sebastian Inlet. From the south side on the ocean side. That is brown tide coming out on a dropping tide coming out of Sebastian Inlet. And you can see the big color contrast. And you can understand why seagrass can't survive under that, right? There's no sunlight getting through. But water quality isn't just about that, it's about the timing, amount, and location. So way back when, Indian River Lagoon, the fresh water reached the lagoon through many, many small creeks. But because of our changes in how we manage our water, it now comes in through a handful of canals and a couple of what we'll call creeks or rivers that are remnant. When you change those types of things, the timing, amount, and location, you cause major changes to the ecology of the estuary. A lot of species can't survive those changes. So for example, oysters do really well in medium salinity or the salt content of the water. If it's fresh water for more than 2 weeks, those oysters are going to die. If it's total salt water for too long, they don't do well because of disease and parasites and predators. So having that good water balance is how these estuaries have evolved over time, and we've done a lot to change that. Then there's also kind of the elephant in the room. Since we're here close to the Lake O discharge, that's what the Everglades used to look like, and this is how the flows go now, right? So the watershed, and I'll talk more about watersheds, for where we're sitting now, it used to be a very small area, but now that watershed goes all the way up to Orlando. So a lot more water, as Zach said, hundreds of millions of gallons a day coming out that shouldn't be there. And so those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with on a regular basis. Another issue with water quality is wastewater. This is actually a pretty modern wastewater treatment facility, but a lot of Florida's wastewater infrastructure was from the 50s and 60s, and it hasn't been upgraded. So up where I am in the Melbourne area, even worse is Titusville. I think they have probably spills out of Titusville every 2 weeks because they're over capacity. Even when they filter the water, the effluent often still contains too many nutrients, and those nutrients are what cause the algae blooms that I've already shown you the picture of. But the systems don't remove contaminants, pharmaceuticals being one of those groups of contaminants. And I'll take you farther down the rabbit hole about pharmaceuticals here shortly. So if you have bad water quality, you get algae blooms, plankton blooms like this. This is Sebastian Inlet down here. This was the bloom last summer. That was extensive and caused a pretty sizable fish kill. We also get benthic or bottom-dwelling algae, and this is covering mangrove prop roots, which of course cause damage to the mangroves. And then of course when it makes the news is when we get those large-scale fish kills. But there's all the things I've talked about so far that have put us at a deficit are this is the result, right? So a lot of times we don't know about this until this happens, but all these other things are already going on. And that's a lot of the work that myself, Zach, and colleagues are doing to try and get the policies changed so we can start addressing these deficits. Another issue is a lot of other contaminants. So this is a pipe coming off of Route 1 up in Melbourne, and there's no filter. So when it rains, that goes straight into the Indian River Lagoon. So it includes things like microplastics, tire rubber, pesticides, herbicides, everything that kind of flows off of stormwater without any type of filter. And we're trying to push Department of Transportation to deal with this better than they have, for sure. So that's just the surface water. But most of Florida's fresh water is underground. We don't see it. And that connects us even more. So this map shows the different major aquifers. And you can see here that lots of parts of the state are connected. So as we draw water down here, we're actually affecting that entire aquifer. To give you an idea of how that effect is occurring, the amount of water going into the west coast of Florida, say around Cedar Key, appears to be decreasing, in large part because of extra water being drawn by Jacksonville and Orlando for development. So things that are happening hundreds of miles away are affecting the ecology on the west coast. And like I said, I'm going to come back to these major points, and so you're going to see how all this ties together. So there's broad connectivity. It crosses surface watersheds. I'll show you surface watersheds here in a minute. The high flows into rivers and estuaries. The Indian River Lagoon, especially the northern Indian River Lagoon, receives a very large portion of its freshwater input from seeps coming out of the aquifer. So we think of surface water, but a large portion comes in from seeps. Over in Tampa, if I remember the numbers correctly, the amount of fresh water coming up in Tampa through springs is equivalent to 30% of all the freshwater flow coming from the rivers on the Gulf Coast of Florida. That's a lot of water. And that's not being regulated very well either. But all the things I'm talking about as far as contaminants, nutrients, all those types of things, they're in the aquifers as well. The Floridan aquifer, it went over here, is estimated to be 60 feet below what it was 60, 70 years ago. That's a lot of water gone. And it's a source of water for springs. So this is from the Florida Springs Institute, a map of the current mapped or known springs throughout the state. A lot of these don't really exist much anymore because of that loss of aquifer water. Why is there less flow? Residential use is a big one. Agricultural use is a big one. As one example for residential use, in a lot of municipalities, about 60% of freshwater use goes to landscaping. So if we're drawing down these aquifers that are causing a lot of ecological damage for landscaping, that's something that is pretty easily fixable with a little bit of cultural change. Also, all the nutrients from agriculture, wastewater, stormwater runoff, all the other things I've talked about, they're coming up through the springs too. So now there's some springs that are having large-scale algae blooms, just like we're seeing in our coastal waters. See, isn't this fun stuff? I promise you, it's going to get better. So part of the problem is the structure we use to manage our natural resources. This is where it's going to get a little bit wonky, so stick with me. So there are silos in how we do fisheries management. One silo is what we call stock assessments. So scientists will go out and then they'll record the number of fish people are catching, the sizes of those fish, whether they're reproductively active, growth rates, all those types of things. And they use that information to estimate the population size of the fish, and so how many fish can be harvested and still have a healthy population. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. That's just a bunch of math. The problem is, the second silo, which I've been talking about for the past 15 minutes, is all the fish habitats, all the things that the fish need in order to survive. Where they spawn, where the juveniles grow up, such as in nurseries, water quality, all those types of things are not part of the stock assessment process. So we already have a system where the things that we know make fish populations successful in many ways are not incorporated into how we manage the fisheries. And that was fine 120 years ago when stock assessment methods were created, but now that we're having habitat and water quality problems, we need to change how that works. Another silo that's not included, and I'm going to bounce into here in a second, is recreational fishers, the people who fish recreationally. There's a lot of economic value. Cultural value is very high. A lot of people move to Florida for the fishing. And there's what we call, and I'll dig into this a little bit more, called local ecological knowledge. So somebody who spends a lot of time on the water has a lot of knowledge based on that experience. And it might not be scientifically valid knowledge by itself, but it can help scientists figure a lot of things out. As Zach said, I like to fish a lot, and so personally I'm able to kind of combine those, but also be able to talk to other fishermen about that type of thing. We've made some really good shortcuts, shortened the learning curve to figure out some of the stuff I'm talking about tonight. So before I get to a fisher's knowledge, I want to take you down the rabbit hole a little bit more about pharmaceuticals. A lot of pharmaceuticals in our fish, and I'll show you some numbers here in a second. So basically, when we take medications, our body only processes maybe 50%. The rest we excrete, and so it goes into a wastewater system. That could go into sewage treatment plants I've already talked about. A lot of it, in Florida especially, goes into septic systems. Septic systems are in no way designed to do anything but remove some of the nutrients. And depending on the system, they don't remove nutrients so well. So 2/3 in Florida, about 2/3 of our wastewater goes into sewage treatment systems, sewage treatment plants, and about 1/3 through septic systems. The number of septic systems in Florida is greater than any other state in the nation. We still have a lot of them, and I'll talk about converting some of them to sewage treatment, but that's a big challenge. And again, pharmaceuticals are not removed. So when wastewater treatment plants process the sewage and have the effluent, in some places it's an ocean outfall, such as off of some locations in South Florida. Other places they could do what's called deep water well injection, which goes down to about 3,000 feet, which is out of sight, out of mind, but it goes into some of the aquifers. And so if, to the extent that pharmaceuticals and other contaminants do not decay over time, it's going to be in that water whenever and wherever it goes, and we don't know the answer to that. Shallow well injection over maybe 100 feet is problematic because Florida is mostly limestone and sand, and so when that goes down to 100 feet, it often very quickly percolates back up. So they're having to refit a well injection system in Big Pine Key in the Florida Keys because of this. They've been able to document that's kind of bubbling up. So the findings, redfish. So just for those who don't fish, that's a redfish or red drum, part of the recreational fishery, very important, but in dire straits in the Indian River Lagoon. So 94% of redfish we sampled had pharmaceuticals in their tissues. On average, redfish had 2 pharmaceuticals. So every redfish had 2 pharmaceuticals. Some had more. We did a separate study on bonefish, and one poor bonefish had 18 pharmaceuticals in its system. Can you imagine going to your pharmacist and say, I want all these 18 drugs, and there's not going to be any interactive effects. 17 different pharmaceuticals were detected, and you can see the list of the top ones there. If we look at the locations, we sampled from Pensacola all the way around the Gulf Coast and all the way up to Jacksonville. Interestingly, the Indian River Lagoon samples were only from the northern Indian River Lagoon because when we did this study a few years ago, there weren't enough redfish in the southern IRL for us to be able to get a full enough sample, which is frustrating and challenging. So I'll talk about some of the effects of the top pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of unknowns, but overall, the physiological systems of fish are very similar to ours, so there are probably similar impacts to them. Tramadol causes gill and liver damage. It lowers activity. When it says more bold and asocial, that basically means that fish are not going to be as afraid of predators, right? If you're more bold, you don't really care about the risk of being eaten, and so the chance of them being eaten goes up. If they're asocial, that means that their chances of successfully reproducing or spawning go down because they're going to be less likely to interact with fish during spawning. Delayed hatching, that means that once the fish spawn, the eggs don't hatch as quickly as they should, and that causes the death rate to go very high. Caffeine, yes, it's a drug, and you can see the effects, just like if you drink way too much caffeine, you get the anxiety, the shakes, erratic movement. But here's a big one, is cell and DNA damage. And one of the things that we found with this study, there's another unknown, is that redfish with more pharmaceuticals in their systems were at lower weight for their length than fish that didn't have pharmaceuticals in their systems, right? So they're basically pretty stressed out from all this type of stuff, and so they have pretty low body weight. So if you went to your doctor and let's say you were supposed to be 160 pounds based on your height and you were 120, that'd be cause for concern. And that's the type of thing that we're dealing with here. So that was wastewater treatment plants. This is a picture that the warmer the color, the higher the density or number of on-site treatment disposal systems, in other words, septic tanks. These are the densities of septic tanks in Florida. Interesting thing here, I've underlined at the bottom, if you have a density of over 15 per square kilometer, you result in contamination. 15 per square kilometer is in the third level there, and that's vast portions of the state. And that's the easy stuff about contamination, not all going all through the pharmaceutical type of stuff. Okay, you guys getting depressed enough yet? Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to start we've leveled off, and we're going to start bringing things up a little bit. Okay, so as scientists, how do we monitor all this kind of stuff and get the information to the policymakers so they can hopefully improve things? For assessing the Indian River Lagoon, we look at things like water quality, the amount of nutrients in the water. I've talked about that a lot. Chlorophyll A is basically a way to measure the amount of plankton or algae in the water. And of course, we track harmful algal blooms. We should be tracking things like land use and freshwater inflows, but we do a very poor job of that. For example, the Sebastian River up by me, I've asked twice now the people who would know, and they don't have any flow meters on the Sebastian River. So we don't know how much fresh water is coming in to those systems, which you already know the problems with that. What we do a lot, and I'll focus on this now, is look at the aerial extent or the amount of spatial coverage of seagrass. And they can use satellite imagery, but also get in the water and swim some lines or transects to do this. So for the Indian River Lagoon, on the left axis is the aerial extent, and on the bottom axis is the year. And every few years they'll sample. And you can see for a while the seagrass coverage of the aerial extent was expanding. The blue line is the 2010 cold event that happened. How many people remember that 2010 event? Some people here? Okay, for those that don't, in 2010, it was about a 10-day period where the wind was blowing out of the north about 30 to 40 miles an hour, and so it pushed a lot of water out. The nighttime temperatures were in the 30s in large portions of Florida, and even lower in some places. So much so that it caused massive fish kills throughout the state, all the way out through the Florida Keys. At that time, I was living over in the West Coast in Charlotte Harbor, and we estimated that it killed about 60% of the snook population. So large amounts. There was some seagrass die-off, but what happened in the Indian River Lagoon is there was a massive algae bloom that followed that, brown tide mostly. That algae bloom created shade, so the seagrass that was already stressed from the cold didn't have any sunlight, and massive amounts of seagrass died off. You can see here from 30,000 hectares to about 17 just in that short time period. So we've used seagrass aerial coverage for a long time to kind of get an idea of how healthy the estuary is. But we're finding out, and now I'll go back into the the fisherman knowledge, fisher's knowledge, to show that even that monitoring metric isn't adequate, because in large part because of what we've done to our system. So basically what we did is we interviewed people who'd been fishing in the Indian River Lagoon back from the 80s, not just the past 10 years, but going back 40 years. Sat down with a map and asked them to draw their top go-to spots. How many people in here fish? You never ever tell anybody where you fish, right? You're never going to give it up. I'll die with all my fishing spots right here. And so, yeah, it took a lot of trust for these guys to work with us on this, but they got the overall reason for the study. Not all the fishing spots, but their top 2 that they could go to reliably. We asked them to break it down by decade, so that for the 1980s, for example, they'd use a red pen and they'd draw circles around the spots that were the go-to spots. And I interviewed 10 people who've been fishing across that 40-year time span continuously. And 10 doesn't seem a lot, but there's not a whole lot of people who fished that 40-year time span in the IRL. And there was a pretty good representation. So here's what we found. On the left, you'll see that in the 1990s, they showed 254 fishing spots, pretty well spread. By the 2020s, they were down to 93 fishing spots that they reliably fished as go-to spots. That's a pretty significant decline. So if you look at it by decade, the number of fishing spots on the left axis and then the decade on the bottom, I've got that cold kill period marked again by the blue line. You'll see that the decline started in the 2000s. So all this thought by the scientific community that the 2010 cold event caused the system to collapse is starting to fall apart, because the fish depend upon the habitats that we've already talked about. They'll go where the habitats remain. The fishermen figure that out and go where the fish are. So as there's fewer fish and less habitat, the number of spots declines. So the system was declining already. We can also look at commercial landings. The landings in tons over here, the blue line, and then year on the bottom. This is for clams and crabs only. It was hard for us to use fish because in 1995, nets were banned for the mullet fishery. And so there was a big drop-off. So we just kind of pushed that aside. The red line is the number of commercial licenses. And that dropped in 95. It's been pretty steady. But you can see that except for 1 year in 2005, there's been a pretty steady decline and then just a low level of harvest since the 1990s, especially in the 2000s, which matches the recreational fishing effort data. So if we take a look, here's the fishing spots by decade. The green bars I've already shown you for the aerial coverage, spatial coverage of the seagrass. The red line is what we call percent cover. So for same areas that we'll take pictures of, we'll set out a line, transect, swim that line, and every so often we'll put out about a meter square, 3 foot by 3 foot square, and estimate the percent of bottom that's covered by seagrass. And so you'll see here that the percent cover started declining in the late 90s and continued to decline and got worse after the 2010 event, but was already in decline. And that was reflected by less success recreational fishing and lower commercial landings. So in 2000, a colleague wrote a report about the Indian River Lagoon, and he talked about how, because of development, stormwater runoff, changing our freshwater flows, agricultural runoff, that the estuary had already begun to decline in the 1990s, which is now reflected by the fishery data, right? So even the data that we're collecting a lot of times isn't adequate, but if we start using more people to contribute, we can get better numbers. So what kind of work is ongoing? I can speak to Brevard County, where I'm from. I'm familiar with it. Those of you here, St. Lucie or Martin counties, can probably find the same information. Brevard County has 432 projects planned to address sources of too many nutrients and contaminants going into the IRL. They've completed 97, 99 are underway, a bunch more are being planned. And the way most of this is funded is in 2016, residents of Brevard County overwhelmingly supported a half-cent sales tax increase to be able to pay for this stuff. That comes up for renewal in a couple of years, and so hopefully that continues. One of the things that I really like is septic upgrades. You can see the green is septic conversions to sewage treatment or better improved septic systems are in progress. Planned is some yellow, complete is the purple. Eventually, we hope that all of Barrier Island becomes non-septic, sewage treatment only, because all those places, just like here, you're only a couple feet above sea level. For a septic system to work, your drain field has to have 3 or more feet of dry ground underneath of it. When we have rainy season, that doesn't happen. So in my neighborhood, people who get pools dug in their backyard, they sometimes have to have the water pumped out of the hole for weeks because that water table is so high, which means that their septic systems aren't working very well. And all that goes straight into the Indian River Lagoon. There's also wastewater treatment plant upgrades going on right now in Brevard County, I think at 4 different plants, which is fantastic. The legislature in Tallahassee provided over the past 2 years $175 million for this type of work, and so that's where a lot of this is coming from. And a lot of that was from the Infrastructure Reduction Act, which came from DC. All right, so talk to you about all the bad stuff, talk to you about some of the information we're finding as the researchers to inform the doctors or the policymakers. So now I'm going to finish up by talking about how we need to address this. Everything we've talked about so far has been, for the most part, at the local level. Septic tanks, sewage treatment type of things, water runoff into a certain part of the estuary. What we have to start thinking about and managing is what we call a landscape scale. And so, to give you the definition right there, it's big scale. It's not about a small little place, even say a county is too small. It's got to be bigger than that. And so for large scale, I mean watersheds. It's an entire region. And I'm going to show you some examples of this with maps to show you from how far away other people's actions are influencing what happens right here in your portion of the Indian River Lagoon. So this is a map of the watersheds in the state of Florida. And you can see there's a lot of them. Florida is very flat, though. So the joke is, in South Florida, somebody with energy and a shovel in a weekend can cross the boundary of a watershed by digging a ditch. And so some of these aren't quite as valid as they used to be. Overlaid on that is the water management districts. And they're the ones who are the first level of responsibility for water management and habitat management. Note South Florida Water Management District, we're going to come back to that one. For the most part, the districts reflect the different watersheds, although there's a few boundaries that don't quite agree. It has to be a multi-agency approach. Remember I talked about silos in fisheries management, right? The silos between agencies, and not just in Florida, but pretty much across the board, are insane. So, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, they're supposed to manage our fisheries and our wildlife. They do some habitat conservation, and they do some species conservation. But as I talked about with the silos of fisheries management, they do all of these things, but there's not a lot of integration between them. And that's within an agency. And I don't want to make this sound like I'm hitting on FWC. It's not their fault, it's the system that they've been given. And that's one of the things that we have to change. Just because it worked 50, 60 years ago, actually it didn't, but we didn't know it didn't, it doesn't work now. And so there has to be a paradigm shift. Florida Department of Environmental Protection, they mostly focus on environmental regulation. They do some stuff with water quality and habitat as well. So if somebody comes in and wants to put in a development, DEP is kind of the primary agency dealing with that. Unfortunately, because they work at the smaller scales, they don't look at the impact of a development on the watershed. Whereas FWC is trying to look at that bigger scale, but they can't manage habitat and development. They can have input to a conversation, but they don't really have any sway. The water management districts, which I just showed you, they're kind of the more regional. They're focused on water flows, preventing flooding, trying to repair some of the past mistakes like water alteration. And they do some habitat management, often in the form of habitat restoration. And then at the local level, municipalities and counties, wastewater treatment I've talked about, they're the first line for development, although that's kind of changing with some of the stuff from Tallahassee. And there's some work on habitat and water quality. The key here is that there's not integration between these. There's conversations and there's meetings, but there's not true integration, as in somebody says, okay, here are all the moving parts, you guys do this and make it all together into one. There's a lot of different dots all over the place that aren't really connected. So it's like you have a lot of dots for an elephant, but you're missing some of them, so you're never going to draw the whole elephant. Public and private, or what we call stakeholder involvement, is also very important. This is happening on land, but it's not happening yet with water. So, how many people have heard of the Florida Wildlife Corridor? Okay, not many. Basically, the Florida Wildlife Corridor is an idea started by colleagues at University of Florida, for the most part, and a couple others. And what they want to do is create a corridor or connectivity throughout the state so that wildlife can move and migrate. So say if you're a panther down in the Everglades, you should be able to conceivably migrate all the way up to Georgia, uninterrupted. But that can't just happen from a state or agency perspective. So this map shows different color. Conserved lands, the dark green is stuff that's already set aside, like Everglades National Park. Opportunity areas are places that they've identified that would be very important. Florida Forever is a state program that identifies land to purchase for conservation, private land to purchase for conservation. And then the final one, the dark purple, is what's called the Rural and Family Lands Project, and that is basically working with, say, agricultural farmers, a lot of cattle farmers up near where I am, so that they manage their lands in a conservation responsible way to allow this type of movement and other conservation benefits. So that basically requires, what did I list? 5 different agencies, public sector, private sector, all working together. And right now, we don't have the structure that does that for our fish and water. So now we get to the whole thing about the scale, the downstream effects. This is Charlotte Harbor on the Gulf Coast of Florida. The red is the main watershed for the Peace and Myakka rivers, and it goes way north, as far north as North Tampa, but inland of the state. So when people are thinking about Charlotte Harbor, very few are thinking about that far away. For those of you familiar, Arcadia is right here, and it's twice as far as Arcadia. That water, the things are doing up there affecting the Peace River, which goes into Charlotte Harbor, and then smaller watersheds that are closer to the estuary. So if we're going to think about the health of the Charlotte Harbor estuary, we can't just think about the local stuff I've been talking about. We have to manage at these much broader scales. And those jurisdictions, or those lines of the watershed, cross all the different jurisdictions of every state agency I just summarized. And there's not a whole lot of collaboration. Closer to home, the watersheds for the Indian River Lagoon. Does anybody see a problem with this? Yeah. The one here, it doesn't quite fit, does it? So, according to the watershed maps, the Southern IRL, this is the watershed. But we know that we're getting a watershed that actually goes all the way up to Orlando, right? And it's not being managed that way. As Zach said, 700 and some million gallons a day coming out because they want to manage that watershed for Lake Okeechobee is affecting the watershed here. That's a big problem, and that's not part of the management structure. And even though you're getting a lot of gallons here, consider yourselves lucky. Where it goes out on the west coast, Caloosahatchee River, twice as much. Sometimes 3 times as much. They don't have as much political sway. So they get a lot more. And those flows are a big cause of red tide, or the intensity of red tide. So, kind of close up here about how can we leverage fisheries, right? I like to fish. I study fish. How can we leverage them to be more influential in conservation? So this is the marketing type of thing. After all that I've said, you might think that the marketing's kind of false, right? Because we're not doing a lot to protect the fisheries. But if you look at the money, $11 billion and over 100,000 jobs from just the saltwater recreational fishery. Freshwater, about half that. Commercial fishery, a little bit less than that. That's a lot of money. If you look at the fishery economic impacts, it's bigger than a large number of Florida's economic sectors, but it's not getting nearly as much attention, say, as agriculture. And I think that that can change. So if we go back into land conservation, they've been doing this type of work for much, much longer than we have. They have a concept that's called umbrella species. So you think about a species that, let's say like black bear. So a single black bear might need 10 square miles of habitat in order to satisfy its needs. If you conserve that 10 square miles, you're also conserving and protecting the needs of a lot of other species that have smaller ranges within. So you kind of create an umbrella. So if we take juvenile snook, which is an economically important species, and we protect the habitats like mangrove creeks and wetlands, we also protect 55 other species that don't have any real appeal to the public. Like, who wants to really, protect mud minnows, right? Mud minnows. Nobody likes mud minnows. But if you'd like to eat blue crabs, there's juvenile blue crabs in these places. And a lot of these feed all the fish and everything else that supports the rest of the fishery. If you take a look at Charlotte Harbor, that's a little baby snook in my hand for scale. Charlotte Harbor, again, on the west coast. Every one of these wetlands and creeks that are named here are juvenile snook habitats. And using this approach, we're working with the state to make sure every single one of these spots is protected, which is a great first step, and we're making a lot of progress. But what am I not covering? The watersheds that feed all these creeks. That's the next step that we're working on. Flagship species. You guys all know about flagship species. It's basically a popular charismatic species that increases attention and awareness. And so here's some pretty typical. Everybody's seen those pictures, right? Those are called flagship species. They get people interested enough that they pressure the politicians to do something about it. So we're using snook as a flagship species because of the economic and cultural value. That's just kind of a random selection of magazine covers of 4 different magazines that feature snook, right? And they're worth billions of dollars a year. And so that helps us leverage the fishing community to push on the state to actually improve how they're managing in the ways that I'm talking about. So why does this matter? On the left is land use developed versus not in 2010. And on the right is what's expected for 2020. So if we don't get our act together now, we're going to have no chance of working on this issue. But again, the good thing is I told you all the bad stuff. We've done all the research to figure out the disease. Now we just need the political will, the doctors, to treat the patient. And the thing is that all of us in the room care enough to be here. We're the ones who have to be the patient advocates. And if you've had a loved one who's been sick or in the hospital, you know that being a patient advocate is hugely important. That's the attitude we have to take towards this type of stuff. And with that, I'll wrap it up, take any questions. If you do QR codes, that'll get to our website, and you can look about more about what we do. So yeah, any questions? That's all I have. Yes?
How can we, as individuals, put pressure on our representatives?
Okay, so the question was, how can we as individuals put pressure on representatives? Call them, email them, go to county commission meetings. Hardly anybody does. So in Brevard County, where I live, maybe last year, there was an issue with some water quality, and I went to a commission meeting, and I brought it up, and they said they'd never heard anybody talk about it. But if I was at the bar after fishing during the day, that's all everybody was talking about. So it's basically, you got to be the squeaky wheel.
So what should we say?
I can give you some talking points for sure. They're a bit too complex for here. But the bottom line is you want the wastewater infrastructure fixed. That's going to cost a lot of money because they didn't do it before. That's massive. And that's going to take 10, 15 years. They need to fix how they're managing development. Right now, it's out of control. Up where I am in Brevard County, it's all the stuff we're doing in the Indian River Lagoon is getting offset by the development. Those are probably the two top ones. And at the county level, you can have an influence on both of those. And if people think they're going to get unelected, then they're going to pay attention. Yeah.
I want to take a Zoom question that's related to that. How do we get other counties in the Indian River Lagoon region to follow Brevard County's lead with respect to a half-cent sales tax to help the IRL?
Great question. Talk to, in Brevard County, our Director of Natural Resources is Virginia Barker. Is that Virginia asking the question? No, okay. I was going to say, wow. There's people in Brevard County, Save Our Indian River Lagoon, and a couple others that have that experience. So if anybody wants to know about that, they can reach out to me or to the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program as well. And they can get they should be able to get a blueprint on how to get that going. But it takes a lot of public outreach to educate people so they know it's important. Another one.
We'll take another one from Zoom because it relates to what you just mentioned. You mentioned the National Estuary Program. How do the National Estuary Programs aid the state agencies that you were talking about during your presentation?
So National Estuary Programs are a great umbrella organization. They can have broad organizational powers. They don't have any enforcement powers, but they're kind of a place where all the different entities that I've talked about can get together. Not just state agencies, but federal agencies, universities, that type of thing, to collectively work on these issues and push them forward. So the IRL is fortunate that it is a national estuary, part of that program. There's a few others around the state. But yeah, it's it needs a lot of support, for sure.
You posted a picture of the Sebastian Inlet with all the brown tide. Is that recent?
So the question is about the picture from the Sebastian River with the brown tide. That particular picture was 2018, 2019. The first one I showed of the algae bloom on the inside was from last summer. Okay, so back in 2018, there was a massive red tide off the west coast of Florida that lasted well over a year and caused amazing ecological damage. It was so intense, this has only happened a couple times before, actually wrapped around through the Florida Keys, up the Atlantic side, and where I am in Melbourne Beach, on onshore wind day, we could actually smell it and taste it. Red tide on the East Coast is extremely rare. So at one point, I didn't include the map. In 2018, if you looked at all the different algae blooms and fish kills in the state of Florida, it looked like the wildfire maps from Los Angeles last month. It was that intense. And that's what got us a lot of this. People finally started paying attention, but we shouldn't have to have those types of moments to get us interested. But again, I don't want to, again, that's concerning, but that should motivate us to try and fix it because we know we know the disease and we know the cure for the disease. We just need to apply the treatment. Over here. Yes. Antibiotics in fish? Oh yeah. Oh, antibiotics are ubiquitous in our environment. Yeah, these days. In the Florida Keys study, antibiotics were a big one. I think we detected 58 different pharmaceuticals there. Yeah, so they're everywhere. The pharmaceuticals, yeah, I mean, they're causing the same types of effects they are for the fish as us. Antibiotics are a concern because if they're in the environment, that's a good place for these bacteria to start becoming resistant. So, yeah, that's a concern as well. Yes? No. Sorry. Do the pharmaceuticals in the fish make the fish unhealthy to eat? Current research says no. The levels of pharmaceuticals in the fish are high enough to be therapeutic for the fish. They're not high enough to be therapeutic for people. You'd have to eat hundreds of fish that are contaminated. However, there's been no research on chronic exposure. So if you're eating fish every single day from the Indian River Lagoon, we don't know what those effects are. And that hasn't been studied. That's a concern. So while most of our concerns are about the ecological implications so far, but a lot of that data hasn't been looked at. Yeah.
So is there any way to get the wastewater to get pharmaceuticals out?
The question is there any way for waste treatment plants to get pharmaceuticals out? Yes. Ozone treatment. They have retrofitted or are retrofitting sewage treatment plants in Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, and one other spot to remove pharmaceuticals. The ozone also gets rid of a lot of other contaminants. A colleague in Sweden did an estimate, and he figured the cost per household was like buying an extra beer per week. So if you spread it out, it's not that much. And so one of the things we're trying to work with is, as they upgrade these treatment plants for nutrients, is to have them throw in the ozone as well. Just to give you an idea about ozone, it's used in aquaculture a lot, so that all the incoming water coming into the tanks, they put it through ozone treatment because it kills everything. They don't want diseases and whatnot coming into those tanks. A lot of water treatment systems for urban areas use ozone to make sure the water's clean. Orlando, for example. And Mississippi River, where they get a lot of the water from the river's so contaminated now, most of the treatment plants have ozonation for their drinking water. So it works well and it's pretty cheap. Yes? So to what extent do tides offset the freshwater coming into estuaries? They can moderate it on an immediate time scale, but if you think about it as, this is the range between freshwater and tide, saltwater coming in. If you increase this by a lot, the tide keeps coming in and going out, but it gets farther and farther away. It can't push back as far. So you'll get times where there's so much water coming out of Sebastian River that the Sebastian Inlet is just about fresh. Over on the Gulf Coast in Charlotte Harbor, when the Caloosahatchee is flowing like it is now, there are times in some of the inlets passes there where the water is always going out. You can't see a tide change. So it can overwhelm the fresh water, if it's enough, can overwhelm the tidal cycle. They can moderate the release of fresh water, it's just not a priority. So Army Corps of Engineers has control of Lake Okeechobee, and they control it for agricultural use for water and also for lake levels to keep the lake at a healthy level for that system, but also so it doesn't overflow the dikes, which they've just rebuilt because they were having problems. Second, so they're considered emergency water releases, and that allows them to bypass the the water EPA Water Act. So yeah, it's a system that's based on trying to drain the Everglades, 80 years ago. I couldn't tell you about the volume of salt water being used by power plants for cooling. That's way outside of my. You had a question? Yes. Bringing out of the rabbit hole is showing you that we know all about the terrible parts of the disease. And so if we show up at the hospital and we're with the right doctors, we're going to get cured. We just got to figure out how to get to the right hospital.
Go to your site. Will you start listing things for us to do?
Yeah, we have some advocacy stuff. So if you go to the site, if it's not there now, we'll get it on there. We on and off, depending on what's going on, we have things where you can contact your local representatives, and that's a big one. Yeah.
Let's grab a Zoom question. Would protecting the lagoon and nearshore reefs as a marine protected area or a national park be a viable option for protecting these ecosystems?
The short answer is no, because what's impacting the Indian River Lagoon ecosystem isn't what's happening in the Indian River Lagoon, it's what's happening in the watershed. And so you'd put a circle around the IRL, but you're not changing what's coming into it. And so that type of management is good for preserving particular habitat, say like a mangrove wetland from development, but it's not affecting all the issues that are basically causing the disease that we're talking about. So it's got to be a big picture. It's hard, and it's harder because the people who came before us, they kind of expensed it forward. They didn't take care of the problem, so we're the ones kind of stuck with it. But and it's, you know, to be honest, it's not for us. Most of us, there's a couple here it is for, because to fix this is going to be past our living years. It's for the kids, the next generations. And so, you know, for me, I'm kind of mad at previous generations for putting us in this spot. But here we are, so it's our responsibility, I think, to get it fixed. The question is, do I do other programs like this for elementary and high schools? Oh, yeah, all over the place. Yeah, for sure, all over the place. Different levels. A lot of education. FOS does a lot of education on this type of thing. A lot of other groups, Brevard Zoo does a lot of these types of programs. So yeah, there's a lot of effort going on, which helps, and the kids will tell their parents. But mostly it's about getting the word out to people who vote. Because again, if people who are in office don't think that an issue is going to keep them from getting reelected, they're not going to pay it any attention. And so I keep telling my friends who fish, just forget everything else and vote on this issue to make sure it gets changed. And in the recent Brevard County election, we actually got 2 new commissioners who get it. So that's an improvement. Yeah.
Let's grab another Zoom question. Could you speak more about the impacts of agricultural runoff on the Indian River Lagoon?
Oh, great question. So the impacts of agricultural runoff depend on where you are in the lagoon. If you're in the northern lagoon, like where I am, it's the vast majority is residential stormwater runoff and wastewater treatment. If you're in the southern Indian River Lagoon, you've got a bunch of that too from the development, but you also have the agricultural runoff, a lot of it coming out of Lake Okeechobee, the center of the state. So it depends on where you are, the relative importance of those different sources of nutrients. Over in places like, say, the Big Bend area, they're working pretty hard and they're making great improvements on making agriculture more responsible about what flows down into the estuaries. And they're having, yeah, great success. Their problem now is that a lot of the farms are being sold off for new developments. And so now they're having all the problems that I've just been talking about in places that they never had before. So it depends, but it's all important.
With everything that's going on in Washington, have you felt any impact on research and science regarding these issues, or do you anticipate some of that coming up?
Okay, the question is, with all this going on in Washington, have we felt the impacts of that, or do we anticipate it? We haven't directly felt the impacts yet, but based on conversations with colleagues who are kind of closer to it, I would anticipate that we would. Bonefish Tarpon Trust, the overwhelming majority of our money comes from individual and corporate donors who are invested in the fishery. So in that sense, we're somewhat sheltered. But colleagues working for other nonprofit organizations like Conservation International, Nature Conservancy, yeah, they've lost tens of millions of dollars. So we'll have secondary effects because the projects they can't do would have helped with some of our work in a collaborative way. But there's just so much unknown right now. Ask me that in a month and I'll probably have a better answer. Okay, so the question is about water temperature and whether that's affecting the lagoon. Yeah, I could only take you so far down the rabbit hole. I didn't do climate change. But yes, water temperatures are becoming a problem. So we're seeing a bunch of subtropical and tropical species moving farther north. Snook, for example, used to never be north of, say, Cape Canaveral. Now they're regularly in Jacksonville. And so that's, on the one hand, that's great for fishing, right? Because you catch snook farther north. But that also brings with it a lot of other issues, so that fish in the summers can get basically too hot, too stressed. And we're starting to see some fish kills from that in the Florida Keys. Not last summer, the previous summer, the water temperature in some of the central Keys got up to 100 and something degrees, 105 degrees, I think. And that caused pretty big fish kills. So we're going to start seeing more of that. The flip side of that is because of the climate change and the reduction in the difference between the tropics and the poles, the structure that kept things like the polar vortex up there breaks down. And so that's what caused the 2010 freeze. Before that, the previous one was 1997, I want to say. So we'll probably see more of that type of extreme. And those extremes just, wreak havoc. So yeah, it is a big problem, temperature.
Does the Lake Okeechobee discharge change temperature in the IRL?
Does the Lake Okeechobee discharge change temperature in the IRL? I don't know the answer to that. Do you? Zach? Anyone?
What do you think, Mark? Do you want to chime in, Mark? The question was, does the discharges from Lake Okeechobee affect water temperature in the IRL? Who better to answer that than Mark Perry?
Yeah, the water temperatures in Okeechobee do come in as the discharges come into the IRL, and they can affect it. But the primary driver for temperature in IRL is how shallow the water is, and also how much sunlight energy is reaching that water body. So the temperature effects changes from the IRL discharges or the Okeechobee discharge in the IRL probably are not as great as what occurs over atmospheric conditions and stuff.
Great, thanks, Mark. And actually, we have a Zoom question that may be related to temperature as well. Somebody was curious to see if you have any news about the cause of the spinning fish that were observed in the Florida Keys last year.
Yeah, spinning fish. It's looking like all the data all the evidence is pointing towards a type of algae called Gambierdiscus. And Gambierdiscus is in a group of algae, family of algae called dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates are what cause red tide. If you have any knowledge of North Carolina back in the 90s, it caused some pretty severe issues up in some of those estuaries. Dinoflagellates are weird beasts. They can change form and photosynthesize or eat things. But essentially, Gambierdiscus seems to do better under stressed conditions. So if a reef or an area is compromised environmentally, that's when it seems to do better. We think what kicked that off was that heat wave I talked about from 2 summers ago. And now Gambierdiscus seems to be kind of at a high enough level that there's always a little bit of spinning fish, but not as bad as it was. So then the question becomes, will it always be there? And we don't know the answer to that. But my personal opinion is probably part of the new normal down there. Gambierdiscus is not doing this in the Florida Keys, but it is the species in other locations responsible for ciguatera, ciguatoxin poisoning. But we're not even close to that in the Keys yet. But in other places, when it gets really established, that could be a problem.
Aaron, here's another good question from our Zoom audience. Is there any evidence that the herbicide glyphosate contributes to the loss of seagrasses in the IRL or other estuaries?
Glyphosate. Glyphosate's a problem. When we addressed this last year, boy, was I getting some hate mail. So I'm going to say stuff's going to give me more hate mail. So glyphosate effects on seagrass hasn't been well studied, so we're not sure, but it makes sense. Glyphosate was believed to basically break down into smaller pieces of its construction in a relatively short amount of time. But what it looks like is that doesn't happen because glyphosate is pretty ubiquitous. So the nonprofit group Orca, how many people know about Orca? Right, great group. Edie's doing a great job. They've sampled, last I checked, they'd sampled like 140 fish from the Indian River Lagoon that fishermen had brought them. Something like 99, 98% had glyphosate in their tissue. So that means that either glyphosate is spread throughout the system or it's being put into the system on such a regular basis that the fish are getting exposed. Research, not here, but on fish in other places, South America, Europe, elsewhere, shows significant negative effects of glyphosate on everything from reproduction to liver function to brain function to juvenile growth to hatching. Problematic enough that one study in Brazil looked at the effect of glyphosate on growth of tilapia in aquaculture farms because the water they're bringing into their system had glyphosate in it, and it was river water from runoff. So for seagrass effects, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of other negative effects. Right now, glyphosate is Roundup, basically. It's the active ingredient in Roundup. So people use it on their lawns. Please don't. Use high concentrate vinegar, 40% vinegar, which you can get at Lowe's, and that'll kill anything. Mix the vinegar with some Dawn soap so that when you spray it, it sticks to the leaves, and you're going to kill the weeds. And the vinegar just basically dissipates and dilutes. Glyphosate is used by municipalities, water management districts, and state agencies for weed control. So you'll go along the roads and see some of the ditches and they're spraying in there. They want to knock down the weeds so that when there's water flow, the weeds don't slow down the water. But they're spraying Roundup often. They're also spraying it in lakes like Lake Okeechobee to get rid of hydrilla invasive species. There's a group, the Isaac Walton League, has done some work on this. They basically created floating lawnmowers that would go through the lakes and cut up and then harvest all those weeds. Then they chop it up, make it a slurry, and they spray it on farm fields as fertilizer. The fields grow hay, they harvest the hay, send it off to farms, so they're exporting all those nutrients from the system. One of the problems with spraying glyphosate to kill weeds is that you do kill the weeds, but then the weeds decompose, and they release all the nutrients that were in their tissue back into the system, and you're still adding more nutrients, and I gave you a lot of examples of that, and so you're compounding all that each time you do it. Whereas if you remove it, it's better long-term, it costs more short-term, but a lot of what we're talking about in a broader sense are legacy effects of what's been done before. And legacy effects are always more expensive, right? It's cheaper and more effective if you go to your annual doctor appointment every year for preventative medicine versus wait for the emergency room, which might not work, and it's going to make you bankrupt. And so that's kind of the situation we're in. I think glyphosate's a good example.
Let's take another Zoom question. I think we have time for maybe one or two more here at the Blake Library. This person mentions that manatees are another flagship and umbrella species. Will protecting manatees and their habitat help fishing interests?
Yeah, it's all related. My favorite tarpon spots are also manatee hotspots. So all those species are related. Yeah, they're a good flagship species. They've become political hot potato around the state, unfortunately. But yeah, they're a good one. Dolphins are another one. You know, most of the dolphins in the Indian River Lagoon are in there. The ones you see on the ocean are usually different. And we're finding a lot of health issues related to all this contaminant stuff in the dolphins as well. So yeah, there's a lot of options for the flagship and umbrella species for sure.
Any other questions here at the Blake? All right, well, help me thank Aaron for an amazing presentation about a very important topic. Hold on. Before you guys run off, I just want to remind everybody that we do put recordings of these lectures up on our website. Right now, we have the first 3 lectures posted. I anticipate getting our next lecture up within the next few days. So if you missed any of this year's lectures, you can go on our website and watch them. I hope to see all of you here in a week for Kelly Martin's presentation all about leatherback sea turtles. And then just a reminder, if you had a good time tonight, think about maybe making a small donation to support Florida Oceanographic Society on your way out. Even if every one of you just put $1 in the jar in the back, so to speak, it would help us fund this series and keep it going as a free resource for our community. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.